So I'm currently replaying The Last of Us Part 2, and as someone who finds world building and lore very interesting, I decided to share my thoughts and theories about the quarantine zones. There will be spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2, and The Last of Us Left Behind. I hope you enjoy it. The quarantine zones in The Last of Us are supposed to protect the remaining healthy population from the infected, which is actually the exact opposite of quarantine, but that's another theme. Most of them are already fallen at the beginning of The Last of Us Part 1. Their downfall was often caused by uprisings, but before we get to that, we need an overview on all 5 known zones. We know something about 5 different quarantine zones: Boston, Pittsburgh, Denver, Salt Lake City, and Seattle. Boston is the only functioning quarantine zone that we see in the games. Boston is officially under the control of the Federal Disaster Response Agency, which are the remainings of the United States government. But Boston is actually a military dictatorship where public executions, lack of food, and violence are normal. This map tells us that the quarantine zone is not that big. It only spans around a couple of blocks. I think that the zone was way bigger. Boston had a prior outbreak population of almost 680,000 people, and this QZ seems to have only room for about 5 to 10,000 people. So where did the other people go? My theory goes like this. At some point in those 20 years, this way bigger zone collapsed, probably because of an cordyceps outbreak. The authorities lost control over the situation and decided to abandon the remaining population outside of the wall, and they just bombed everything away to reduce the probability of an infection from the outside. We learn about that in this dialogue with Tess.
So what happened here? They bombed the hell out of the surrounding areas to the quarantine zones, hoping to kill as much of the infected as possible. And it worked.
In the early stages of the outbreak, the quarantine zone was way bigger, but probably not that secured. The fact that entire towns like Lincoln were evacuated to the zone tells me that the authorities of the Boston QZ either overestimated their resources or really had enough of them to support hundreds of thousands of people. The people don't have much to lose, and this brings us to the state of the resistance against the authorities. The Firefly is fighting a guerrilla war against the military, and it does not look good for them. It's pointed out several times that the Fireflies are close to their complete eradication. I think that the situation in Boston is very similar to the situation in Northern Ireland during the so-called Troubles, where shootings and bombings occurred on a daily basis. Interestingly, the strategy that the Fireflies are using is a very similar strategy that the IRA used in Northern Ireland. This strategy can be summarized in one word: escalation. During the Troubles, the plan of the IRA was to use as much violence as possible against the British authorities and other Protestants to provoke the other side to use also more violence against the IRA and other Catholics. This was supposed to provoke a civil war between these two sides. The Fireflies used this strategy in Boston and apparently a lot of other cities, but it just didn't work out in Boston. In Pittsburgh, the plan did work out. We find evidence for this in a letter that we can find in the financial district. The Fireflies started the fight, probably with the same tactic that they used in Boston and other cities, and this time it worked. But the remaining population of Pittsburgh didn't want to join the fight, and I think that the Fireflies had to leave the city in the end. I believe that this could be one of the causes for the downfall of the Fireflies. The amount of support in the normal population that was necessary for a nationwide uprising was a few times too often just not there. The main reason for the uprising was probably a combination of the lack of food and corruption. At a checkpoint where we can find a few graffitis where this is pointed out. This little optional dialogue with Joel and Ellie gives us also a bit of information about the corruption.
Why wouldn't they give them their food?
Sometimes they ran out. Most times they just held on to it.
That never happened in Boston.
Trust me, it happened all the time.
This letter of a soldier where he talks about the execution of an officer gives us also information. The letter is dated on the 10th of October. I think this date tells us a lot when it comes to the circumstances of the uprising. We already know that the main cause of the uprising was a hunger crisis. The people were probably already enraged due to a hunger crisis that happened in the past winter. This was very regular a few hundred years ago, so I think it's possible that this could happen in the world of The Last of Us. This, combined with the constant provocation of the Fireflies and the corruption, led to a massive uprising. Soldiers were executed in the streets. Some of them were soaked in gasoline and were set on fire. The so-called truck note tells us that the remaining soldiers were hunted and killed. The note tells us also that the military had heavy artillery, but most of it was destroyed during the uprising. As I said, some time after the uprising, something went wrong. I suspect that the Fireflies were either thrown out of the zone by another violent uprising or, and I think this theory is more realistic, the Fireflies left the zone on their own when they realized that they had not enough support in Pittsburgh to bring the fight to other cities, and left. By then, at the latest, the city had fallen into total anarchy. We know the least about Denver. In the Left Behind DLC, we can find a crashed helicopter that was flying back to the Denver quarantine zone. We don't know from where they came from. I think that the Denver QZ had either outposts or another nearby quarantine zone. The closest ones could be Kansas City in Kansas or Albuquerque in New Mexico. From this dialogue in The Last of Us 2, we know that there was some kind of Firefly insurgency in Denver.
Like what? He said he blew up a checkpoint at Denver QZ, killed 3 soldiers, and 2 civilians.
Salt Lake City is another abandoned quarantine zone, and when I say abandoned, I mean there are, except the Fireflies in the hospital, apparently no humans in the city anymore. We can find a map of the zone in a tent at the bus depot. The zone seems very small to me and also not very secured. We do not see any big walls like in Boston or Seattle, just these, I don't know, fences. This map, and especially the marks on it, tell us a bit about what could have happened here. My theory goes like this. At some point, there was a cordyceps outbreak in the zone. The military lost control of the situation and evacuated everyone through these 2 routes on the map to the bus station. According to the blood on the walls of the tents, infected persons were shot here, and I think this is an indication that there was also an outbreak here, and I don't think anyone came out here alive. The Fireflies used this situation and overthrew the remaining military and took over the hospital. I don't think that there was much fighting. A fast and efficient coup with low casualties seems more likely to me. Seattle was a very large zone and also heavily secured by large walls. But the reason for the downfall of the Seattle quarantine zone came from the inside. The Washington Liberation Front, or WLF, took over the city in long, brutal, civil war-like fights. Seattle is totally overgrown. Rivers are floating through the city, and the dead military bodies that we can find all look very old. I think that the zone fell at least 10 years before the events of Part 2. I mean, I don't think it happens that fast that parts of the city are so flooded that a boat is required to move around. This letter that we can find in the courthouse tells us a lot of interesting things. The letter by Lieutenant Carmelo Torres is supposed to be sent to the Federal Central Command, so there was still communication between the zones. In this message, he talks about that the zone will soon fall into the hands of the WLF. He also talks about that key personnel will be evacuated to QZ-24. We can learn 2 things here. There were at least 24 QZs in the United States, even though I think that there were a lot more. Even if there was only 1 quarantine zone per state, there would be still at least 50 QZs in the entire United States. We don't know which city QZ-24 really is, but I strongly suspect that these 2 cities are either Portland in Oregon or Boise in Idaho, because they are close to Seattle and as the capitals of their federal states, large and important enough for the creation of a quarantine zone. Lieutenant Torres talks also about the Seattle quarantine zone has a population of about a few thousand. So I think that my theory about the Boston quarantine zone could also have happened here. The zone was once bigger, but an unknown event, probably an outbreak, caused the downfall of a large part of the zone. This letter here tells us also something. At some point, Fedra stopped letting people in and expelled more and more. I think these people who were expelled were probably WLF members that were expelled because their crimes weren't hard enough to punish them with death, but they wasted too much resources while they were in prison. The Thursday Market Massacre is an event that is mentioned in a letter that we can find also in the courthouse. The term massacre is very important here. Even though we don't know much about this event, I think that this event was one of the key elements in the uprising in Seattle. An event similar to the storm of the Bastille during the French Revolution. It was an event that escalated everything and brought Seattle into a full-blown civil war. So now you reached my totally not uncreative end card of my video. Thanks for watching. If you have any further questions, please write them down in the comments. I wish you a good day. Goodbye.